Well, thank you very much. It is an honor for me to be here, to have been invited, and I will just, okay, yes, make sure. So I have a great deal of respect for those who focus on families, as typically when I think about where we need to intervene, I always think first the family level and then the community level as well. Approaching work from more of a social ecological perspective. And today I'll be talking specifically about identity formation in youth in mixed status families. And I will define what mixed status families means. Now, I'd like to start out with this quote by Erickson from 1968 that says, "Identity is a process located in the core of the individual and yet also in the core of his or her communal culture." And I will talk in this presentation about how the individual and the communal are important when we're talking about immigrant families, but also the contextual and sociopolitical climate is just as critical in understanding their experience. Just a brief recap of identity literature. Identity refers to the salient dimensions that define who we are, what we are, and what groups we belong to. It's certainly a developmental process, and in fact, many of the well-known theories of identity focus on stages of exploration, commitment, questioning commitments, and although this process begins in adolescence, in childhood, I mean, it's during adolescence that identity begins to consolidate, but then also sometimes shift away from identities that they developed in childhood, which were mostly just a transmission of what parents believe in to be important, kids usually believe in to be important, but then as they begin to develop talents and new interests in adolescence, they start to shift also in their identities. And although identity is a very subjective experience, really about who you see yourself to be and how you see yourself connected to others in this world, it's a very subjective experience. You can try to explain to others what it's like or why you feel that way, but really it's just from a culmination of experiences, positive and negative, and of interactions they've had with others that define who they are, and this process of course takes place over time. And we know that healthy identity has been linked with very positive outcomes, both not only in terms of performance, but also in terms of adjustment in community settings, and also has been linked with strong and positive self-esteem as well as mental health outcomes. Now, identity is multidimensional, and for minority groups, ethnic identity is a very salient dimension. And we know that, or ethnic identity has been defined as those attitudes and behaviors that are consistent with the significance of meaning of race and ethnicity in our own lives. That is, we might see ourselves based on the culture or based on the practices of our families, but then also of our communities, and we start acting on those by following some of those practices, by identifying ourselves as part of an ethnic group, and by possibly interacting more with people who are part of that ethnic group. And a positive ethnic identity is one where the individual both has a sense of pride about their heritage, as well as pride about their current environment and how that's shaped who they are. But it's also when the person can anticipate that there will be challenges in society based on discrimination, prejudice, stereotypes that others might have of them. And the key is preparing for that bias. How do you handle those situations in the moment? And then also, how do you not let those situations get under your skin and define who you are? And how does that develop? Well, it begins with the family. The family instilling a sense of pride through the foods that they eat, the language that they speak, the activities that they engage in. But then it can also be reinforced by peers. And in many ways, structurally, society can send messages about how that ethnicity or that ethnic identity fits within the larger scheme and either contributes to or is unwelcomed in society. Now, there have been a few models of how Latino identity develops, and this is one of the probably most well-known models by Arredondo and colleagues. And their model is called the Latino Personal Identity Model, and they propose that there are 3 dimensions. In the first dimension, those are the identities into which the individual is born into for the most part. Your identified sex at birth, your race, ethnicity, your ability or disability status. So you may be born into those. And those identities tend to be the most visible of those and are often also the identities upon which you can experience discrimination. Now, in the second dimension, those are more developmental and more fluid aspects of identity, meaning that they can shift over time. A person can develop in terms of their educational background, in terms of where they live. So they're more fluid, and they're also less visible, such as, for example, your relationships, your work experience, and your health. And then finally, the third dimension refers to more distal, historical, and societal events that can either reaffirm or can shift someone's identity. So somebody may have a life experience, such as a death in the family, that might then change the course of their lives and might change their prospects about a sense of stability, of security. And so all of those are historical moments. Now, although models such as the Arredondo model are important in terms of acknowledging that identity, that some aspects of identity are more static while others are more fluid, and that society plays a role in them, there are some shortcomings, particularly when you think about the immigrant experience. For example, they assume, or these models such as these assume that citizenship status is fluid, meaning part of dimension B. And while currently in our society, there really is no formal path to citizenship. There used to be in previous decades. Currently, there are not. The only way that you can go from, if you're in this country illegally, and I'll use that word in quotes, the only way that you can become a citizen is if a family member who is a citizen can request you, or if you are a victim of a crime and therefore can apply for a U visa and have your status adjusted. And then more recently with some immigration reforms, there's DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And what that law does is that it protects youth who came to this country brought by their parents and who are in high school, getting ready to go to college. It protects them from deportation and allows them to have a driver's license so they can have a work permit and they can drive. But that is it's a temporary arrangement, and it also doesn't ensure that the next step is citizenship. These models also place the historical and the socio-political context as something that is distal and less influential in the individual's lives. And for these families, I argue that the historical and socio-political context is front and center. So let's look at what these families are like. Over the past couple of decades, or possibly prior to that, it was possible for immigrant families to come to the U.S., work in farms during the summer, and then they could go back to their country of origin. And the majority of families did that. They never intended to live here. They just came for better job opportunities and then would return. But then what happened over the last couple of decades is that we tightened our border enforcement. And what that did is that then families were forced to either go back to Mexico and stay there, or simply stay here. And when they weigh the conditions in Mexico with increasing drug violence, extreme poverty, to what they could have here, many of them chose to stay. So although the border enforcement was intended to discourage families from coming or from staying, what it did is that it forced them to stay and to not be able to travel back. And so that has given rise to many mixed status families. Mixed status families are those where a family member is unauthorized to reside here, but where one or more family members are either born in the U.S. or have some sort of naturalization that allows them to be here. There are currently over 16 million individuals living in these types of families, and so you can imagine that identity formation must be very complex in these families, where some individuals have authorized families and others have not. And yet, when we tend to think about identity development, we tend to think about it as something that happens within the individual in a social vacuum, as opposed to an experience that is collective and shared by family members. So what are some of the experiences of youth in these types of families? We know that youth who are born in the U.S. have access to privileges like any other U.S. citizen, yet research has consistently shown that they tend to underutilize these services, perhaps because the parents who do not have authorized status are vigilant and try to remain under the radar, and so they don't seek to utilize resources that their children are entitled to. And so even though children have rights, they often live under the shadows with their parents and experience a great deal of shame about their family status. But then their unauthorized siblings have a different experience. So these are siblings who were born in a different country, have the experience of growing up or maybe spending some time there in that other country, so they feel connected to that, but then they've also had the experience of living here and growing up under a different set of norms and expectations. They certainly lack privileges that their U.S.-born siblings have access to, and their identity in many ways is defined not progressively, but almost like a door slamming in your face when they come into age. So a lot of youth that I have met with and spoken with over the years talk about how they didn't know that they weren't born in the U.S. until they were maybe 16, 17, or 18, when they were ready to apply to scholarships, get a driver's license, when they wanted to take out a bank account and realize that the reason why they didn't have a Social Security number was because they were not here with the proper papers needed to do all of those things. So this is a moment where, in many ways, identity happens like this as they're coming into age. The work that I do takes related to immigrant families takes place in Arizona, and Arizona is the state that probably has passed the most restrictive immigration policy of all states. We know that in times of economic and political crisis, there's always, immigration comes up as an issue that affects our society, and certainly immigration has been at the center of political debate. Now, Arizona, so I started this work when Arizona passed SB 1070, which was in 2010. However, in the previous decade, they had passed several other laws, such as English-only laws, banning ethnic studies in the state, in schools, in public schools, and increasingly had incorporated more restrictions on employment. But what SB 1070 did is that it put immigration enforcement in the hands of police officers. And so what that did is that it created a climate of constantly being stopped by police, asked to show proof of citizenship, which I don't know how many of you carry proof of citizenship around, but so they were expected to show proof of citizenship, and then there were also really tight penalties for those who employed or provided housing to unauthorized immigrants. And we know that other states such as South Carolina, Alabama, and Georgia passed similar states. And at the national level, what has happened is that there has been this discourse that devalues and dehumanizes, I would say, not only immigrant youth or youth of immigrant families, I would also say youth of color in general. And so that, all of those experiences that they're watching, taking in, hearing about all the time, hearing parents talk about it, has certainly have to have implications for their identity. So, the purpose of this study is to explore the salient identities of authorized and unauthorized youth within mixed status families, specifically, to identify the factors that shape those identities, and then also to more specifically examine how context in Arizona, but I would argue also at a national level, how it influences identity and well-being. My approach to this is to do an extended case study method, and a case study method it's a compromise or an alternative to just doing qualitative interviews, let's say following phenomenology, which focus a great deal on the subjective experience. But it's also not ethnography, which focuses a great deal on culture. So the extended case method proposes that the subjective experience is constantly changing and highly influenced by the social context. So that means that in order for you to understand what the experience is for an individual, you have to look at the broader systems that are affecting how individuals experience and cope with adversity or with change in their lives. And one way that the context can be more integrated into the analysis is by collecting data over an extended period of time, by using mixed methods, as well as participatory approaches. For example, I have participated in protests that an organization in Phoenix would say, while I was there, would call me and would say, there's a protest that's going to happen outside of a Walmart because of this. I would go and I would participate and observe. I visit families in their homes, interview family members, and if there is an aspect of family life that seems important and that's linked to an external institution, so for example, church or school or something else, then I attend church with them and I participate because I want to see how all of these different experiences and different sources can be supportive to families. What I will present today is based on 10 youth that are part of 4 different families. These youth are in the 13 to 18-year-old range. All of the families had both parents who are unauthorized or undocumented. At least one child who was U.S. born and at least one child who was also of unauthorized status. And this data, the case study, I've actually been conducting since 2014 or so, or 2015, early 2015. But these participants actually come from another study that I was involved in since 2007, which was the Children, Families, and Schools. And that was a very large study of, as Julie mentioned, of FAST, that we wanted to explore whether FAST could build social capital in a heterogeneous sample of Latinos. So we were in Texas and in Arizona implementing FAST across 26 schools, another 26 schools being in a comparison group, and then following, and these were children who were entering the first grade, but it was a universal intervention, so meaning all first grade children across 52 schools were recruited to participate, whether it was just as a comparison or as an actual intervention. And during that study, SB 1070 was passed and we started hearing about how our families in Phoenix were afraid to come to FAST meetings or were having experiences, or many of them had parents who were cut up in raids and put in detention or deported. So I then started conducting focus groups about how SB 1070 was affecting families. And then the 4 families that I'll be reporting on today come from that initial group of focus groups, and we also have longitudinal quantitative data on those families from when the children were in the first grade. Okay, so this study is called Lives of Immigrant Families, and I will, since I already mentioned some of the activities that I've conducted, but I do want to point out that many of these youth really struggle to talk about these issues. And so one approach that we took in our interviews was to ask them to draw something. So for example, I was interviewing one adolescent who kept referring to, well, since I'm not from here, well, I guess maybe I am from here, but I'm not really from here. But he couldn't quite explain it, so I asked him, can you draw what it means to be from here? And so I will show you that drawing later on. And what we found was that by using these drawings, it allowed them to express what their goals, but also what their aspirations and what their dreams were, without putting them on the spot to have to tell somebody, a stranger, about these things. So we conducted we've been traveling every month and a half or so, but the interviews that I will be talking about today come from 2 different time points. And you can see some of the questions, how we started asking them very generally, how do you see yourself? We were interested in actually exploring whether they would talk about their immigration status or their ethnic identity spontaneously. And in cases where that didn't come up, then we asked them more specifically about those aspects of their identity. Okay, so In terms of themes, the first theme that we found was that indeed there were salient identities that were spontaneously shared. However, most of the time, youth talked about things that they do in their day-to-day lives, as opposed to deeper rooted meanings of who they are. So you can see in the top picture, one talked about being a good student and getting a good GPA. In this bottom picture, I guess because of lighting you can't see many of the details, but this is a student who talks about being an athlete and playing soccer, and here's a soccer net, and there's another soccer net on the side. So they really talk more about these day-to-day activities. But then when prompted a little bit deeper about how they see themselves in the groups that they belong to, we saw that authorized youth, so those who were born in the U.S., really tied their identity to where they were born. I think I'm Mexican American because both my parents are from Mexico and I was born here. And then another one saying, I'm not really an immigrant because I'm from here. My older brother is not an immigrant because he's also from here. But my middle brother is an immigrant because he was born in Mexico and came with my parents. So what's interesting about this is that although they talk about where they're born, they use where other family members were born as a point of reference as well, right? So that seems to solidify for them who they are relative to who others in their family are. There were some youth who also talked about their parents' identity in terms of where their parents were born or what their traditions, culture, and language were. And often those characteristics shape the norms of the family. So this one adolescent saying, I would honestly consider myself Mexican more than American. So this is a U.S. born, right? So consider myself Mexican more than American like my parents. Mexican to me means loving their culture, loving your culture, speaking Spanish, having lots of parties. Thought that was funny. Having lots of parties, the food, family members, friends. So they equate Mexican culture with more of a collective, shared experience that's fun, jovial. And then the second quote saying, I see myself as Mexican because we only speak Spanish at home. So that is what's familiar to them and the way that they've been socialized by others and by their other people's identities is also influential. Now, for unauthorized youth within these families, this seemed to be a little bit more complex and a little bit more layered. So they did similarly talk about where they were born, but they also talked a lot about where they've grown up. It's not uncommon for many youth who have come to this country to have come from a very early age, sometimes at 6 months, at 2 years, and so most of their life has been lived here. It's interesting also that for them, they definitely talked about that. The US born siblings didn't. It was almost like they just took that for granted, right? But these kids didn't take it for granted. And although they felt that where they grew up was important because that's where their peers and their family lived and their life is what they're familiar with, they also felt that this was incompatible with what society believes to be legitimate. And so this brought a lot of ambivalence for them. And in terms of, if you think about identity processes of exploration and commitment, and then an unwillingness to commit because of this lack of legitimacy. Here's a youth saying, and I never lived in Mexico for more than 6 months when I was a baby. I never went to school or anything there, so I don't know. You know what I mean? It's just basically I didn't consider myself from here, but I was just basically I'm from here, but not technically because I wasn't born here, but I've been raised here my whole life. So you can just pick up on the ambivalence of, and the constantly going back and forth of, I feel connected to here because this is what I've known, but I know that ultimately what counts is where I was born, because the subjective feeling is not legitimate, is not valued in society. Here's another example of how this legitimacy and ambivalence plays out. I mean, well, now I kind of do feel like I'm from here because I have a social now. So this is a youth who recently became eligible for DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So then he continues to say, like, I have some type of something backing me up, like a, you know what I mean? Yeah, basically that it's more legit. Before I could just say that, oh, I was from here, but I didn't have anything to prove that maybe I could be from here. Now I can. I have a social, meaning Social Security, at least to show that I could be here in a work permit and all that to work, and yeah, before I could say I'm from here, but I had nothing to prove it. Now I can prove it. And what this also indicates is that paper is critical. And that paper, regardless of how you felt all your life, that paper is what really makes a difference in terms of how you see yourself. But it also shows the privilege that paper affords. And so that is actually the second theme, that identity and privilege are recognized but have differential impacts on youth, and in many ways some shared impacts. So this is a drawing of a US-born kid who talked about the opportunities that he has access to because he was born in the US. And so he sees himself, it says here, that he's going to be a doctor and is going to live in a mansion, and he's going to have a soccer field next to the mansion. So this is somebody who says, I can have access to all of these different things because I have rights to them. And so authorized youth like him talk about the advantages that come with their citizenship. And those advantages they categorized as traveling, which is interesting. We don't typically think of traveling. I mean, oftentimes we just get in the car and we can go on a road trip anywhere. Well, a lot of these families can't do that because they're afraid of being stopped. So they talked about travel, about independence, to do what you want to do, get a driver's license, drive a car if you want to, about greater job opportunities, and overall social class mobility. But there's also an awareness that these advantages are not shared by everyone in the family. So that I'm not an immigrant means that I have better opportunities than my parents and my brother do. I can go to places in the US. I have papers. They don't. This other youth saying, I can make something out of my life because I was born here and I have rights and everything, so I can make something out of it that my parents and siblings couldn't because they were born in Mexico. You would think from the previous slide that this privilege, certainly although they see that they can have access to this privilege, many often sometimes feel that this privilege can also be devalued, because although they have access to these resources, their parents don't. And their parents have a stigmatizing status, or their siblings have a stigmatizing status that holds them back. And so what they end up doing is then they continue to remain in the shadows with their parents, always vigilant of something bad that could happen. So I wish, this first quote is of an adolescent whose parents came to the US with a visa, but then they overstayed the visa. Prior to the visa expiring, they traveled back and forth to Mexico, where they got to see their cousins all the time, and their cousins could come here. So this adolescent says, I wish we could travel and see our cousins in Mexico, but we haven't been able to travel since my parents' visa expired. So it's almost like this youth is in a holding pattern until he's independent enough that he can travel on his own. but certainly he can't do that with his family. Another one says, I don't know how I feel about being Mexican in Phoenix. My mom told me not to play with my water gun in the backyard. We don't want to call any attention to the cops. You have to be cautious all the time. So it's almost as if he's unauthorized. Because if you make a wrong step, it could have serious consequences for your family. So authorized youth certainly feel limited by their parents and their family's unauthorized status. This conversation was also part of, he talked about police encounters with African American youth. And so part of his mom's fear was that they live in a very modest home that backs into a golf course. And so there are police patrolling the area of the golf course. This is a beautiful golf course in the middle of South Phoenix, which is around 80% immigrant, low income, very segregated. And so there's a lot of police activity in that area patrolling the golf course, and so that was the context of that conversation as well. Now the unauthorized youth certainly recognized that their status did not come with privilege, but that really doesn't become apparent to them until adolescence, really, and as they're transitioning into emerging adulthood. So here's a quote that I think is very poignant. He says, well, yeah, I realized I was Mexican in the 8th grade because I couldn't work, I couldn't get a permit, I couldn't get anything, so nah, that was already like a limitation, right? So this is somebody whose identity had been shaped a lot about feeling part of U.S. culture and society. They saw themselves as Mexican American, and then this happens, realized I'm just Mexican, right? That's not how we tend to think of identity, but this is oftentimes the common way that they discover that they don't have the privilege that their siblings do. And also with DACA as a prospect, many also talk about how their lives would change if they had DACA. And I asked one youth to draw what it meant to be from here. And so he wrote, being able to leave the country and come back. And so this is like a wall right here between the US and Mexico. Maybe this is Trump's wall, you know, between the US and Mexico, and being able to go back and forth. This is a driver's license, a green card, and then better jobs. So he's holding a computer bag or laptop bag. And he talked about freedom to do all of those things without fear. This other, it's too bad that the drawing is so faded, but I asked him, what would you do if you had papers? And he said, if I had papers, I would travel, because I would want to go to the beach one day, and I've never been to the beach. I don't know what beach. I just want to go to the beach, just see the water. And then one time, I want to go to a place where you could see the sky and the stars. And I asked him, can't you see the sky and the stars from Phoenix? And he said, oh no, you can see them, but I want to see it packed with stars. And I want to see the stars fall. So this is just, it's a very basic dream that one would have. You would expect that having papers would mean better opportunities, but just something as simple as going to the beach or seeing the stars. And then he drew himself here swimming in the ocean, and the sun is coming out. And it's actually a very poignant drawing because it does reflect what his wish is. But if you look at the drawing, it almost feels like he's lost in the sea, and he's there by himself. The final theme is how youth see themselves in the eyes of others. And this means resisting and accepting how others view them. as well. This one youth talked about how the teacher always said mean things about Mexicans, and actually what she says in the drawing is, you guys have a short attention span, and then he's saying over here, I feel stupid. When we asked authorized youth how other people viewed them, they talked about people think we're bad. So that was common. People being racist against us, they think we're always doing something bad, robbing something, doing drugs. Or some people say that Mexicans are bad for this country. Political people think Mexicans are bad for this country. It's not right, and he actually said for Trump to say that because not all Mexicans are bad. And then the next one also mentioned Trump. What Trump says about Mexicans doesn't feel true because I see how hard my dad works. My dad works really hard to get stuff for us. He works in the construction, and that's a tough job. It takes a lot of energy from him. So they're acknowledging these messages, but they're resisting them because they have evidence otherwise that shows that these societal messages are not true. When I asked unauthorized youth the same questions, they also talked about being bad, but it was more about being a criminal. So they say mean things to us to make us mad, or white people, they're like, oh, let's get them mad so they can leave so they won't like it here. And then another one said, like last time, me and my mom were going, I think, to a Family Dollar, and these white people were like staring at us, and they were like, because my mom doesn't know that much English, they were like, oh, go back to Mexico or something, and I just ignored them. Afterwards, it was painful. I really felt it in my heart, but now it just makes me mad. My little brother was more affected. He cried when it happened. Wanted to share that we tried to talk to his little brother. His little brother is 13. Tried to talk to him about that experience as well, and he couldn't. He just cried and cried and cried, and you can just tell. And what his mom thought the reason why it was so affected, what they were so affected by it, is that they were really ashamed that they didn't defend her in the moment. Plus they see themselves as boys, and well, they should have defended mom, and they failed to do that. But imagine, an adult saying to you, go back to Mexico. What's your response in the moment, right? So this is a big burden for them, and a great deal of shame that comes with not having done what they thought was the right thing for their mother. So then we try to understand more how they incorporate what society says about immigrants with how they view their families as being immigrants. So we ask them what it means for their parents to be immigrants. And some youth said, or actually I would say just a very small number said, yeah, my parents are immigrants because they weren't born here. But many of them did not. Many of them denied that their parents were immigrants. And what they did is that they would equate being an immigrant with not having papers. And I'll show you how they can legitimize their parents' status in many ways. But regardless, it was pretty common that they tried to conceal their parents' immigration status. So I wouldn't consider my dad an immigrant because he was given permission to be here. So I wouldn't consider anyone in my family to be considered an immigrant. Immigrant means a person that doesn't have papers and entered the state illegally. The situation with this family was they came to the U.S. with a visa, they overstayed the visa, and have not had authorized status for about 8 years. But this youth really made two assumptions. One is that, well, my parents came with a visa, so they're not immigrants. And the second assumption is to be an immigrant means to be illegal, right? So I, for example, consider myself an immigrant, although I came with residency and a green card and all of that. So for me, in my mind, being an immigrant is somebody who comes from a different country, but in their mind, being an immigrant is being a criminal. So you can see how they have begun to internalize some of these messages and try to distance themselves from this targeted group to possibly, you know, as a way to protect themselves and to protect their, you know, to kind of make sense and resolve this tension that they're experiencing. Here are some examples of how they conceal their parents' identity. They talk about not sharing with other people, not telling other people that their parents are immigrants, or this last one I thought was very interesting. Race don't matter to me. It may matter to some people, but we're all human beings. And you know, that type of egalitarian statement has actually been found to be detrimental to ethnic identity development. What you really want is resistance, so that you don't internalize and you don't then say, well, people aren't being really racist, we're all just the same, you know, I'm just going to take a passive stance as opposed to saying, this is not right, I'm not going to let this affect me, I'm going to fight back. So just to summarize, youth identity in mixed status families is a very complex process. Certainly does not happen in a social vacuum for family members. It's very directly linked not only to your experiences, but also to the experiences of other family members. And although for authorized youth, they talked about where they were born as the main, or where their parents were born as their main source of identity. For an authorized youth, this was very complex. They talked also about where they were born, but really emotionally felt very connected to this new and possibly not so new environment that they've been in, yet they don't feel that they can legitimately claim that because of policies and social discourse on immigration. And that leaves them with a great deal of ambivalence, as well as isolation and potentially shame, denial. Although it is certainly, from a legal point of view, that authorized youth have access to greater privileges than their unauthorized siblings or parents, these privileges are also limited for them as long as their parents' status or their sibling status remains unauthorized. Now, in recent years, and this is a future direction, in recent years we've been seeing many more youth apply to DACA and get DACA, and so this has allowed them to go to college, for example, to drive. It's still a very temporary issue, and it also depends on the administration, right? So depending on who wins the election, DACA could go away completely. And then what I'm hearing a lot from families is the fear that if there are going to be mass deportations, the first people they're going to go after are those people who registered for DACA. Because those are, there's a registry that has their name and address and all of that. So I'm actually traveling back to Phoenix in the week of the election. I made sure to vote here. So I voted this week, but I'll be back for the week of the election because I want to sit with these families as the returns are coming in and just getting a sense from them of what's next for them. Some have talked about they're going to have to move again, go into shadows again, because they don't want to be tracked based on their children being on DACA. So the privilege that comes with DACA is temporary. The privilege that comes with being a U.S.-born youth does not live to its full potential for these youth. given the hostile immigration climate. And if social policy has the intended consequence to discourage immigration or discourage people from staying in this country, it really has the unintended consequence of forcing people to go into an underclass of individuals where they cannot have access to education, cannot have access to healthcare, cannot have access to basic rights that would otherwise make them active, civically engaged individuals in society. And then I think the tragedy with the current state of immigration policy for youth is that, particularly for unauthorized youth, is that before this tightening of enforcement, they felt very connected to their Mexican or their country of origin, to that culture. And they were able to travel and remain and keep those ties, remain connected to that culture. And they could also develop a new sense of who they are relative to this new culture. But now that we've made it very difficult for people to travel back and forth, we are not only limiting their prospects of life here, we're also impeding them from maintaining those connections. So who are they? And that's where that ambivalence comes from. And this whole idea of concealing one's identity, if you think about your immigration status, in many ways, or in some ways, it's an invisible domain, right? People don't know, they might make some assumptions, but unless you tell them and confirm them, it's not as visible as saying your race or your ethnicity. But if you look at also the LGBTQ literature on concealed identity, there's a protective aspect of concealing one's identity, but then there's also an emotional cost of doing that. You feel like you're betraying who you really are. You feel like you're denying aspects of your family or of your life that are meaningful to you. And you also start to develop a sense of shame about your background and your family. So what we really need to do is to have more interventions that open up these conversations, open and active conversations about race, immigration, between parents and youth. My experience with parents, unfortunately, is that the extent of the conversations they have with their youth is to say, just don't pay attention to it, just ignore it. Don't let it get under your skin. But the problem is that it's not as easy to just brush off. And so you really need to say, this is what's happening, this is how you can cope with this, these are the different people who can support you. And so there is some mixed research in this area. There's some research that shows that parents do have these conversations with youth. That hasn't been my experience with parents. Certainly has not been my experience with teachers in Phoenix. Teachers are by far naive about their students' life circumstances, and they have this mentality of don't ask, don't tell. I don't want to know who's in my class, undocumented, I'm not going to ask, I'm just going to focus on their education. Well, okay, but if you have students who are living with their grandparents because their parents are deported or who don't even have a place to live, then how are you meeting their educational needs if you can't also meet their needs, their emotional needs? This is, I believe, the final slide, is that youth identity, in future research, we should perhaps look at larger samples and more longitudinal mixed methods studies to look at how these complexities in identity for youth in mixed status families, how they're actually linked to outcomes over time in terms of health outcomes, educational outcomes. And then we also need to translate these research findings to policy. And particularly now, where we are in a pattern of potentially policy changing depending on the upcoming elections, and so really tracking these policies, but then making sure that these findings make it to policymakers so they can understand the impact of their policies. One, for example, that I think is very relevant to Arizona is this ban on ethnic studies. So basically, children in public schools cannot learn about Martin Luther King or Cesar Chavez or the civil rights movement because it's considered to be potentially subversive content, right? Well, it's part of history. We can't deny it. And the more youth are exposed to these models of how others have resisted and advanced the rights of groups like theirs, then the more affirming they can be of their own identities. So that's one potential information that could go back to policymakers in terms of future decisions. And then finally, the youth that I presented on in general seemed very ambivalent about their identity, but there has been a movement, even in Phoenix, of undocumented and unafraid. And these are youth who have had it and have come out publicly acknowledging their unauthorized status and who have become activists and are very civically engaged in fighting these messages. And it would be interesting to see what about their family circumstances or their social environment made them reach this type of choice or make this choice, and be able to see how identity affirmation has actually taken place for these youth. So I would like to, first of all, thank the funders of this research and also the research team members who travel with me and have helped me with coding this data, which still much more to code. And then also just thank participating families for their courage and for their willingness to share and let me come into their homes and into their lives. So thank you very much.